The night of the 21st of October 1942, somewhere in the western desert of Egypt, roughly 20 miles east of a nondescript railway halt called El Alamein, a man is crouching beside a canvas-covered shape in the darkness. He is a sapper, a royal engineer, and he is doing something that, if a German reconnaissance pilot were to fly overhead at this very moment, would look entirely unremarkable. He is parking a lorry, or rather, that is precisely what it is supposed to look like. What he is actually doing is draping a lightweight wooden and canvas frame over the hull of a British Grant tank, folding it, just so, lashing the ties with practiced speed, and then stepping back into the shadows before the first pale suggestion of dawn can reach across the desert from the east. When the sun rises, the Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft will sweep low over the assembly area, their cameras clicking, their crews scanning the terrain below, and what they will photograph, what they will carry back to Axis intelligence, to be pored over by German staff officers who consider themselves among the most capable military analysts in the world, is a lorry park. A thoroughly ordinary, utterly unremarkable lorry park. There are over 400 Grant tanks hidden in this fashion. Not one of them will be spotted. Elsewhere in the same desert night, in the sprawling southern sector of the front, a different kind of work is underway. Small teams of engineers are assembling structures from calico cloth, local timber, and palm frond hurdles, materials sourced from the very landscape itself. What they are building, piece by piece in the darkness, are tanks. Hundreds of them, artillery guns, supply dumps stretching over kilometers of desert floor, a water pipeline made from discarded petrol cans, steadily extended at an apparent pace of 5 miles per week. None of it is real, all of it is entirely convincing. This is Operation Bertram, and it is about to make Erwin Rommel's armoured command look spectacularly foolish. Within 4 days, roughly 150,000 men, 1,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 1,000 tanks will have been moved, concealed, disguised, or fabricated in plain sight of enemy aerial reconnaissance. And the German High Command will have seen almost none of it. When the barrage opens at 21:40 on the night of the 23rd of October 1942, Rommel's stand-in commander will be utterly unprepared. Axis forces will be oriented towards the wrong end of the battlefield, expecting the wrong kind of attack, believing the assault to be at least several weeks away. The Afrika Korps, the most celebrated armoured force in the world, will be beaten, not just by shells and steel, but by canvas, calico, and a handful of extraordinarily clever British camouflage officers who once sat on a beach and tried to figure out how to make an army disappear. This is the story of the dummy tank, and it changed the course of the Second World War. By the autumn of 1942, the war in North Africa had settled into a grinding, exhausting rhythm that was bleeding both sides dry. The British Eighth Army and the Axis forces of Rommel's Panzer Army Afrika had been trading territory across Libya and Egypt for the better part of 2 years, the front lines surging back and forth across the desert like a tide. Tobruk falling, Tobruk relieved, Gazala lost, the army retreating east in what soldiers bitterly called the Gazala Gallop. By the time Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery arrived to take command, in August 1942, the Eighth Army's back was very nearly against the wall. Rommel had driven them to within roughly 100 kilometers of Alexandria, the Suez Canal, and with it, Britain's entire supply line to India and the Far East was directly threatened. The problem was not simply one of courage or firepower. The British had both. The problem was surprise, or rather, the chronic, humiliating lack of it. Again and again, Axis intelligence had proved able to read British intentions through aerial reconnaissance. The desert was a uniquely unforgiving environment for military deception. There were no forests to hide beneath, no urban sprawl to conceal movement. The terrain was flat, pale, and merciless under the North African sun. Anything moved, assembled, or constructed in daylight could be photographed by a Messerschmitt at 5,000 feet and examined by a German intelligence analyst over his morning coffee. The implications were crushing. To mount an offensive of the scale Montgomery was planning, and he intended it to be decisive, final, the battle that broke the Afrika Korps permanently. He needed to concentrate an enormous force in the northern sector of the front, close to the coast road. That was the only logical attack axis. The front ran for approximately 50 kilometers from the sea in the north to the Qattara Depression in the south. A vast natural obstacle effectively impassable to armor. Every Axis officer with a map and a modicum of tactical sense could see where the attack had to come. Rommel certainly could. The critical question was not where, but when and how strong. If German intelligence could detect the British build-up accurately, the assembly of tanks, the forward positioning of artillery, the stockpiling of thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition, they could calculate when the assault would begin and with what force. They could reinforce the threatened sector. They could orient their armor correctly. They had, in every previous engagement of the Desert War, demonstrated an uncanny ability to do exactly that. What was needed was not merely camouflage. What was needed was an entirely different kind of deception, one that could hide an army of 150,000 men and hide it not just passively, but actively, so convincingly that the enemy would not merely fail to find the real assault force, but would actively believe it was somewhere else. The man tasked with making this possible was Major Geoffrey Barkas, commanding the British Middle East Command Camouflage Directorate at Helwan, a unit staffed largely by artists, architects, and set designers, men whose peacetime instincts ran to illusion, perspective, and the manipulation of what the eye was prepared to believe. Barkas had been doing useful work in the desert for some time, but nothing on the scale he was now being asked to achieve. When Montgomery's chief of staff, Brigadier Francis de Guingamp, outlined the plan, attack in the north, feint in the south, but the entire northern build-up must be made invisible, Barkas and his colleague, Lieutenant Philip Ayrton, walked out to the beach at El Alamein to sit and think. The task, as Barkas fully understood, was enormous. If it failed, the entire deception would be worse than useless. It would confirm to the enemy exactly where the blow was coming. He needed a magic trick on an industrial scale. The solution came in several interlocking pieces, each as ingenious as the last. Its heart was a device called the sun shield. This was, in its physical essence, beautifully simple. A lightweight frame of plywood and canvas, shaped to resemble the profile of a 3-ton lorry when viewed from above. The frame weighed comparatively little and could be assembled and attached to a tank by its crew in a matter of minutes under cover of darkness. From a reconnaissance aircraft at altitude, a Grant or Sherman tank wearing its sun shield was, to all observable purposes, a lorry. Just a lorry, parked in a lorry park, doing whatever lorries do. The frames were produced at workshops in Egypt based on templates developed with obsessive care to match the aerial silhouette of standard British transport vehicles. The camouflage team studied photographs of genuine lorry parks to ensure the shadows fell correctly, that the color and texture of the canvas matched what German cameras would expect to record. In all, 772 sun shields were manufactured and distributed to armored units by mid-October 1942. The complementary device was called the Cannibal, named for the way it swallowed the object it concealed. Where the sun shield transformed a tank into a lorry, the Cannibal transformed a 25-pounder field gun and its quad tractor into what appeared, from above, to be an entirely innocuous transport vehicle. Large canvas tarpaulins envelop the gun and its limber together, with wooden and rope additions mimicking the outline of a truck's bodywork. The wheels from the gun and its tractor completed the silhouette convincingly. In total, 360 cannibals were deployed. Barkas later wrote that the great concentration of 25-pounder guns at El Alamein seemed to have been entirely undetectable, right up to the instant the disguise was thrown off and the gunners opened fire. In the southern sector, where no attack was coming but where Barkas needed the Germans to believe it was, a wholly different kind of construction was underway. Over 1,300 dummy lorries were assembled from locally available materials. Around 300 mock tanks were erected, frameworks of timber and calico shaped into the rough silhouette of armored vehicles, convincing enough at photographic scale to register as the real thing. Dummy supply dumps were built up, representing an apparent 8,000 tons of stores that existed in canvas and shadow rather than steel and petrol. And then there was the pipeline. The dummy water pipeline was perhaps the most audacious individual element of the whole enterprise. A water supply is one of the most revealing indicators of military intent in desert warfare. An army cannot attack without water, and the infrastructure to deliver it takes considerable time to build. The Bertram team constructed a pipeline in the southern sector using thousands of discarded petrol cans, extended at an apparent rate of 5 miles per week. At the time the real attack began in the north, several weeks' worth of pipeline remained apparently unfinished in the south. Strong circumstantial evidence to any analyst studying the aerial photographs that no southern offensive could possibly be imminent. The whole enterprise was supported by a parallel electromagnetic deception codenamed Operation Canwell, which used 25 radio transmitters to mimic the communications net of an entire armored corps in the south, replicating the call signs, traffic volumes, and procedural patterns of a headquarters, 2 divisions, and 5 brigades. The Germans were not only seeing a false army, they were hearing it. Coordinating all of this, Barkas and his team worked with a precision bordering on obsession. Lorries were parked in the Martello assembly area north of El Alamein for weeks before the tanks arrived, so that by the time the armor moved in, German analysis of the area had already settled into a pattern of complacency. Just the same old lorry park, nothing new, nothing threatening. Each tank arrived at night, was assigned a pre-designated hiding spot, had its sun shield rigged before dawn, and left no trace of its movement. Track marks were obliterated, fuel cans collected, a dummy erected in the tank's previous position in the distant staging area so that photographic continuity was maintained. It was not camouflage, it was theater performed in darkness for an audience of one. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operational result was not witnessed by Erwin Rommel himself. On the 23rd of October 1942, the Field Marshal was in Austria on medical leave, recovering from exhaustion and ill health. His stand-in, General Georg Stumer, had studied the available intelligence with care. What he had concluded, what the months of meticulous British deception had led him to conclude, was that no major offensive was imminent. He expected the attack in the south, where the dummy armor and the phantom pipeline pointed. He estimated it would come in several weeks at the earliest, when the false pipeline was complete. At 21:40 on the 23rd of October 1942, roughly 1,000 British guns opened fire simultaneously. It was the largest barrage in the North African campaign. When the flash and noise of that opening salvo registered at Axis headquarters, Stumer's first impulse was to drive forward himself to assess the situation. He died of a heart attack in his vehicle somewhere near the front. Rommel, recalled urgently from Austria, arrived back in Egypt to find his army fighting in exactly the wrong configuration. Armour, positioned for a southern thrust that was not coming, forward artillery already overwhelmed by the real assault in the north, divisions scrambling laterally across a battlefield they had been told to expect 2 weeks later. The Afrika Korps fought hard, as it always did. Rommel was not a man who surrendered easily, but the shape of the battle had been decided before the first shot was fired, in the silent work of canvas and timber makers across weeks of desert nights. Captured after the battle, General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, commander of the Afrika Korps itself, told Montgomery frankly that he had believed the Allies possessed at least one more full-armoured division than they actually did, and that the attack would come in the south. He had been deceived completely. By 4th November 1942, after 12 days of grinding attritional combat, Rommel began his retreat westward. It would not stop until Tunisia. The Afrika Korps, the armoured force that had humiliated British generalship at Gazala and Tobruk, was falling back across the desert from an assault it had been convinced was not coming for weeks. The Panzer Army Afrika retreated 2,400 kilometers in the months that followed. It never returned. Records from Axis headquarters captured subsequently confirmed that not a single element of the real northern build-up had been successfully identified before the battle. The sunshields had worked perfectly. The cannibals had held their secrets until the guns spoke. The dummy army in the south had drawn exactly the analytical attention it was designed to attract. It is worth pausing to consider what the Germans attempted by comparison and what the British had to reckon with before Bertram was conceived. German deception doctrine in the desert relied heavily on the maskirovka principle, the same Soviet concept of concealment and camouflage. Rommel himself was a gifted practitioner of operational surprise, having repeatedly wrong-footed British commanders through speed and audacity rather than elaborate strategic deception. The Germans used dummy positions and false radio traffic as a matter of course. What they did not possess, and what proved decisive, was the organized institutional structure that the British built around deception as a strategic discipline. The London Controlling Section, the body ultimately responsible for Allied strategic deception throughout the war, had no direct German equivalent. The Abwehr, Germany's intelligence service, was riddled with inefficiency and internal politics. German aerial photographic analysis, though technically capable, was operating on assumptions that Bertram's designers had carefully shaped. They saw what they expected to see, which is precisely the most fundamental vulnerability of any intelligence system. American forces in North Africa, operating under Operation Torch from November 1942 onwards, initially lacked the British experience with systematic, large-scale deception they learned. The Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, which the United States eventually assembled for operations in Northern Europe from 1944, was explicitly inspired by British methods in North Africa. The inflatable rubber tanks deployed by the Ghost Army in France and Germany, the sound trucks broadcasting the noise of armoured formations, the false radio traffic, and the impersonated headquarters. All of it traced its conceptual lineage to the work done by Geoffrey Barkas and his team in the Egyptian desert. The sunshield itself was copied, adapted, and refined. Techniques developed at El Alamein for making real vehicles disappear were applied at Anzio in Normandy across the Rhine. The principle that an intelligence analyst sees not what is there, but what the evidence has been arranged to suggest, became one of the foundational doctrines of Allied operational security for the remainder of the war. The historical impact of Operation Bertram has sometimes been debated on the grounds that El Alamein was won ultimately by weight of numbers and material superiority rather than by deception alone. This is not entirely unfair. By October 1942, the 8th Army outnumbered Panzer Army Afrika substantially in tanks, guns and men. Rommel's supply lines were being strangled by British naval and air interdiction in the Mediterranean. A British victory at El Alamein was, in retrospect, likely regardless of the deception. But the margin of victory and the cost of achieving it was profoundly shaped by what Bertram achieved. The mislocation of German armoured reserves, the miscalculation of timing, the confusion in the first critical hours of the battle, these factors compressed the duration of the fighting and reduced British casualties. The psychological blow to the Afrika Korps of being so comprehensively deceived was real and lasting. An army that discovers it has been made to fight in the wrong place, at the wrong time, against a force it was told did not exist, does not recover that confidence easily. Churchill, addressing the House of Commons on the 11th of November 1942, praised the achievement in characteristically resonant terms, noting that complete tactical surprise had been achieved and that Montgomery's armoured corps had moved to its attack positions without detection, leaving behind an exact simulacrum, an image, a ghost of itself. Beyond the immediate battle, Bertram stands as the originating moment of the Allied deception tradition that would culminate in Operation Fortitude South in 1944, the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, the inflatable tanks in the fields of Kent and Suffolk, the false radio traffic that persuaded Hitler to hold back his armoured reserves after D-Day, while the real invasion consolidated at Normandy. That deception, too, was built on the foundation of canvas and calico laid in the Egyptian desert 2 years before. Surviving examples of inflatable and dummy tank technology from this period can be examined at the Imperial War Museum in London, where the institutional memory of Britain's deception war is held. The Camouflage Development and Training Centre at Farnham, which contributed to the intellectual heritage from which Bertram drew, is commemorated in surviving records and archives. Individual sunshield frames did not survive in large numbers. They were field items, practical and expendable, but their imprint on military history is permanent. Return with me for a moment to that desert night. The sapper, crouching beside his canvas-covered tank, tying the last lashing in the darkness. He does not know whether it will work. He does not know whether a German camera will see through the disguise, whether some small inconsistency of shadow or shape will betray what lies beneath. He only knows that his job is to make a 30-ton fighting vehicle disappear before sunrise and that he has perhaps 20 minutes to do it. Consider what Operation Bertram actually achieved. In the space of several weeks in the open desert, under the eyes of Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, the British 8th Army hid 772 tanks, 360 field guns, thousands of tons of stores, and the preparations for the most significant land battle of the war so far. It was not merely concealment, it was replacement. The real substituted for the false substituted for the real, in a sustained act of institutional illusion that required hundreds of men to execute and months of planning to design. And on the other side, an entire Panzer army received a picture of the battlefield that was fundamentally, structurally, catastrophically wrong. Not just slightly wrong, wrong in every significant dimension. Wrong about where the blow was coming, wrong about when it would fall, wrong about the scale of the force about to unleash itself. When the guns opened on the night of the 23rd, General Stumer was in the wrong place with the wrong dispositions, expecting the wrong battle, and did not live to rectify that error. Rommel arrived from Austria to inherit a crisis he had been given no opportunity to anticipate. Von Thoma, one of the finest armoured commanders the Wehrmacht produced, confessed in captivity that he had been fooled completely. The Afrika Korps, the desert legend, the force that had earned fear and respect across 2 years of brilliant mobile warfare, was beaten at El Alamein, in part because of what Barkas and Ayrton sat on a beach and dreamed up. A canvas lorry that hid a tank, a calico silhouette that stood in for a division, a pipeline that pointed towards a battle that was never going to happen. The most celebrated armored force of its age was driven from the field by illusion, misdirection, and the careful architecture of what the enemy had been prepared to believe. 400 tanks hidden under canvas, ready to strike where no armor was supposed to exist. The greatest victories in history are not always won with the biggest guns. Sometimes they are won in the small hours of an October night by a sapper tying a canvas frame to a tank, making sure it looks like a lorry, and slipping back into the dark before the desert sun can give the game away.